Good morning to everyone. It's a blessing. It has been a blessing to be here this morning, and I hope you find it that way as well. Good to see everyone. This morning, for the next session, Brother Paul Yoder is here from Oakland, Maryland, and he has been involved a good bit with Gospel for Asia. They're out of Texas, so I won't say much about that. I'll let him say whatever's on his heart to share about the work that Gospel for Asia has been doing over the years. So I think at this time they are working on the laptop there, and
I'll start winging it until, I'll start winging it till these guys get it figured out. Can you hear me? Okay. 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 My daughter works at, my daughter went to GFA 9 years ago. Paula, our youngest daughter, went to GFA nine years ago to a school of discipleship. She was there for 2 years and then came home and then went back on staff. And we had really appreciated what we saw there. Got to know the people, got to know, got to know the people, and especially got to know like KP Yohannan himself. Ate at his house, they were at our house, and so when Neil and I got married a few years ago, one of the things that we together had said we'd like to do is, once the kids are old enough to leave the nest, we want to do some kind of voluntary service. And the kids have laughed at us recently. They said, "Dad, we were old enough to leave the nest 15 years ago. What do you mean when we're old enough to leave the nest?" But anyhow, Paula did go down there, and so we thought perhaps this would be a good place for us to do voluntary service. So we were just on the verge of doing that, volunteering our services there, and then COVID hit. So that took a back seat for several years. And in the meantime, KP Yohannan, in the meantime, Paula called us and said, "Dad, do you have any pictures of the farm, the animals, and what happens on the farm?" And I said, "Well, yeah." He said, "Well, send me some pictures." She didn't say what she wanted. And then she called me back later and said, "The reason I wanted those pictures is the staff at GFA had been praying for someone to come take care of the farm. There's a 600-acre ranch that was donated to Gospel for Asia there in Texas. And that ranch is where the world headquarters were erected and all the housing for the volunteers there. So they began to pray for someone to come take care of the farm. And then KP asked, "Don't you know of?" Okay, very good. Now, see, first of all, I want you to know I am not a tech guy. I'm much more comfortable hauling a load of manure. I know what I'm doing there. I know what needs to happen. So this is the campus itself, or the headquarters administration. This is Paula on this side and Naoma on the other side. This, let's see if we can get this video to play. Doesn't look on, it's on a play, but this was a video of the front part of the campus. Oh, there we go. Yeah, this is the video, this is the church, the cathedral itself, and then this is the front part of the admin building. It's two-story. Approximate, I would guess, 80 to 100 offices in that building. Uh, and our position was to help out with whatever needed help, or wherever we could. This is the backside. Yeah, this is the backside. Several bodies of water right there around the admin building. A really pretty place. And while you look at that, let me quickly tell you about this gift of the farm. They had been working in Carrollton, which is about 40 miles from this place. A lot of people commuting in to work in the offices, and they were spending an awful lot of money renting a house, commuting, and so on. So they began to pray about perhaps they should build something. And they'd done this for several years, and it kind of got to the point where they had to make a decision one way or the other. So they had a special prayer meeting. KP related this story to me himself. I had a special prayer meeting at should they or should they not. And there were several young people from that were in School of Discipleship that were part of that. And then they began to pray specifically that evening. And an 18-year-old boy got up and said, you know, if God wants us to have a specific place, then we should pray for that. And they said, I am going to pray that before the meeting is over tonight, we'll have it. That's coming from an 18-year-old. KP told me that he said, you know what? He was certain this young man had no concept of what he was praying for. But before the evening was done, KP's cell phone rang or buzzed, and he said he normally does not answer his phone during a service, but he felt he should answer this. So he went outside, and the person on the other end of the phone said, I feel compelled to call you. Is there something that I can do for you? And KP said he kind of stuttered a little bit and said, well, yeah. I said, we're praying about building a facility. And we know where there's a piece of property that we think would work well. But he said, we don't have the finances to do that. And said, well, how much do you need? And it was between $1 and $2 million for the property itself. And the man said, well, I'll send you a check in the morning. That was the beginning of some of the miraculous provisions that God provided there for that. Texas is a beautiful place in the spring. Don't ask me about the middle of the summer. There you see some of the housing in the background. Neil and I live in one of those houses, and there's 80 houses built on the campus for people who work there. And each family or person that lives there rents the house from GFA. Neilma wasn't there let me back up. When KP called us and asked us if we would consider taking care of the farm, we said we would. So we committed ourselves for 2 to 5 years. But I said one thing that we kind of need to take care of. I had a horse barn I just started building, and I said I was planning on finishing that this summer or next summer. So I said, but we could come this winter and go home next summer. So that's what we did. In the meantime, the other barn collapsed with a silo falling on it. So this summer we're rebuilding the barn there on the farm. So yeah, we committed ourselves for a couple years. It wasn't long until they discovered Neilma was quite the cook. And so, in fact, KP was talking to international leaders who were there and the group, and he said, Mrs. Yoder is the best cook in the universe, he said. That was pies she made at Christmas time to pass out. Here I would really like to get this video going if we can. More houses in the background, but it was a special delight to the families there who wanted to garden. They had no garden or didn't know how to take care of a garden, or first of all to prepare it. Okay. So we did 20 plots. We hauled manure, spread fertilizer, and then used a rototiller until all these plots up, 4 individuals there. Helped them plant, and they really, really liked that. I had told them, if we come, I'll help with the farm or whatever I can do. Something I can do with my hand. I said, don't put me in an office behind a desk or to work with a computer. I said, I'm a hands-on man. Okay. Wait a minute. And we can go to the next one. We don't need the audio, but we'll need it later. Okay. So this was a real blessing to the families who wanted a garden. We borrowed a tiller to put behind the tractor so we could till this all up. And the gardens turned out really nice if you get them in early enough before the devastating summer heat comes on. And this year, Paula said they had 50 some days of 100 or 100 degree plus days in a row, 50 days in a row. So whatever you can get before the heat comes on will make a huge difference. Most of the stuff dries up in. That was the first planting Neema did, and that came on really fast. They also figured out Neema has a green thumb. So there were a lot of plants within the 2 stories of the admin building and sort of neglected. So they asked Neema if she would redo the flowers. So I helped Neema redo a lot of the flowers inside, both stories. Here's a planter she did upstairs on the balcony or the porch of the 2nd story. This is another on the bottom. Here, another thing we did quite a bit of is doing dinners, preparing food for groups and so on.
Warmly with my elbow. Oh my God.
I think I'm gonna have some minestrone.
Oh, another thing that was really, really cool is really good. They do a retreat called Set Apart for Young Adults. And what it's designed for is that young adults would come to sit and ponder and listen to speakers. The idea is, what do you want to do with your life? Where are you going? What is your purpose in life? And how can you find purpose in life? And I quickly got to tell you this. Now, this is young adults from all over the U.S. and even some from other countries. The first evening, we were there in the church, and you see, most of them are not Anabaptists, so they're dressed however. Well, this one young man comes. He had hair down over his shoulder, wore a bill cap, had it on backwards, and he came into the church. He was there all evening. Now, that really kind of doesn't sit well with me. And being the kind and humble guy that I am, I wanted to go and just kind of take his hat off and lay it down beside him. But, of course, I didn't do that. Well, the 3rd day, they had just got done singing Happy Birthday. And here this same guy comes rushing in the back of the church, jumping up and down. He said, it happened, it happened, it happened. And we thought there was a wreck or something took place. And somebody ran back and said, the thing that I've been praying for 10 years has come to pass. You know what? He said he had been praying for this Roe versus Wade thing for 10 years. And that day, it was knocked down or whatever it happened. But when that happened, I felt about an inch tall. So many times I look at you guys or whoever, and I think, they're good people because they dress right. I forget that different cultures don't always dress like we do. And I've just been so challenged with some of the young people that we met there. This was a water slide. So we did a water ball game. It was a lot of fun. This was yours truly, and this is Paul and Barnabas. Paul has the shorter beard, and Barnabas has the longer beard. I happened to have a red apron that day, and kind of matched with Bishop Barnabas's. Most people would call that a robe, but they call it a shepherd's frock, and that's what he was wearing. One of the most gentle, sweetest men I've ever met. He exudes the Spirit of Christ. A wonderful, wonderful man. This is KP himself, and I put this on for one reason, and that is his car. Now, I know many people have heard about lawsuits coming against GFA, and that took place Paulo saw the whole thing unfold from end to end. And I'm not going to say a lot about that, but one of the things that was on public media in a detriment to GFA, what happened is there was a root of bitterness developed in the leadership. And that root grew and grew, and except for the hand of God, would have destroyed GFA. One of the things that was on the social media is that this whole thing is a fraud. KP is taking the money that's sent in. He's driving around in vintage cars, just using money that has nothing to do with the mission field. Well, Neil and I are a little different natured, but we were down there, and we knew he had this little bug. And we asked if we could have a ride in it. I said, sure. So he took us on a ride in that thing, and I wanted to ask him, do you have any other vehicles? Just to make sure to silence all the things I had heard about driving these high-dollar cars. And I didn't quite have the nerve, but Neoma did. She said, is this the only vehicle you have? And he said right away, I said, yeah, this is the only vehicle I've ever owned. But there's a story goes with this very vehicle. Years ago, he decided he should have something he can commute with. So he had a secretary to see if she could find a VW Beetle. She found one. They went to buy it, to look at it. And as he looked at it, he told the young lady that had it for sale, isn't that kind of high priced? Kind of facetiously. And she said, well, maybe it is. But she said, I want to be a missionary, and I'm planning to go to the Philippines as a missionary. And I need the money from this car for the tickets and to go to the Philippines. When all this broke out about the fraud, the car, and a whole pile of other things, KP told his secretary, check back and see if you can find out what happened to the girl who bought the car. This lady is still in the Philippines as a missionary that came from the sale of this car. Okay, now the next. Here in the bottom right corner is my nephew Floyd. Floyd and his wife Molly just came back from Asia, went through all the different fields with Gospel for Asia. And he spoke at church 2 weeks ago. And the next slide up will begin a 40 or 45-minute video of a family who lives 300 yards from us. And this family is a tremendous inspiration and challenge to me. They live a daily life of sacrifice. And they do it with a cheerful heart and in good enthusiasm and good spirits. So Floyd won't speak 45 minutes here, but the next one is Jonathan Logry. And if I can get that video to work, this was the beginning of the service at Mountain View 2 weeks ago. And this will tell you much better what Gospel for Asia is all about than myself. So for the next 45 minutes, can you stay awake that long? You'll be listening to this. O God, our Father,
in heaven. I beseech you, Father, that you would be here, that the Holy Spirit would lead, guide, and direct all who speak. And Father, I pray that today, perhaps, seed or seeds would be planted that would one day bring a tremendous harvest for all eternity. Pray that you would guide, lead, and direct today. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Now, before I give him the mic, you can go, but before I give him the mic, forgot what I would say. We'll let it at that.
Good morning. I don't know what he was going to say, but I had a bad feeling about it. Let's see if that comes up. I am, as he said, Jonathan Lawgry, and my family, which you'll get a chance to meet afterwards for sure, and a few of them will be sharing with you. My wife, Erica, and I have 3 of my 4 daughters with me today, Hannah, Abigail, and Rebecca. My 4th could not come, which she was very sad about. We are very honored to be here. We've been looking forward to this for about 6 weeks, I think, since I first found out we were going to be able to do it. For a lot of reasons, partly because of Paul and Naomi, partly because Paula Yoder is a good friend of ours, and we've heard her talk a lot about
Now, what to say?
Oh,
You mentioned Paula.
yes, Paula.
You know, Paula, she's my daughter. And she left the nest first, as in leaving the nest. And so there was a lot of concern. Is Paula going to survive? Who are going to be her friends? What kind of friends will she have? And you know, one of the great delights that I have, that I gathered, is who Paula has chosen to be a mentor. A mother away from home and a family away from home. That's Erica, her daughters, and Jonathan. I'm so happy that she has chosen a family of that quality and that character. Blesses me.
We're happy too. Well, I don't want to start this morning talking about my family. I want to tell you about another family and their story, a family's story that raises a question for me, and it's the way I want to introduce the topic, which is how God is reaching the unreached, not how GFA is reaching the unreached, but what God is doing and how we can be a part of it. So this family I want to tell you about, let's see if this, I have a problem. Hold, please. My job at Gospel for Asia is I am the IT director. And I have no excuse to not be able to load a PowerPoint in front of you this morning. But just as an extra dose of humility, God has arranged that it should blow up on me as I begin. I want to tell you about a man named Manja, who hopefully will be joining us on the screen shortly. Ah, yes. There he is. His name is Manja. He's from Nepal. He was a young man. He actually graduated Bible college, one of GFA's Bible colleges, back in 1997, which is when I graduated from college. He and his young wife went out into the mountains of Nepal. They were sent to villages that had never heard the gospel. They went in, sharing tracts, going door to door, praying with people. Very soon, they had planted a church in a village where there had never been a church before. And that was a really good thing for us and for the brothers and sisters that had come to know the Lord and had come to be part of that church. But it was not from the perspective of the village and the local government a good thing. You see, at that time, Nepal was a Hindu kingdom, and they were not happy about the growth of Christianity. And they were looking for a way, well, to kind of put an end to Manja's ministry. And they found one a few years into his ministry, and they trumped up some charges, accused him of murder, manufactured evidence, attempted to beat a confession out of him but failed, and committed him to prison for 20 years. He left behind his young wife, a 4-year-old daughter, and a 6-year-old son. He didn't know if it was going to be, well, he just didn't know. Nepal's prisons are not like U.S. prisons. They are not heated nor cooled. They do not have sanitation in the way you would expect. They are not nice places. He went through a lot of suffering in prison, separated from his family. They moved him 9 times in the times he was in prison, and it was very difficult for him to ever see his family. But when he was in prison, he began to do the same thing he had been doing out in the villages of Nepal. He began to share the gospel with the people around him. And they began to listen. And people began to come to the faith. He saw prisoners healed as they were prayed for, and Bible studies gathered around him. I think that's one of the reasons they kept moving him around, to sort of disrupt that. But the result was he became a sort of Apostle Paul to Nepali prisons, going from one prison to the next, sharing the gospel, bringing people to the Lord. There were men baptized in Nepali prisons. So he continued his ministry even as he was separated. His wife continued to raise their 2 young children in the Lord, and she was determined not to give up on the ministry that she and her husband had been called to, and that is to bring the gospel to the unreached. So as she raised her children, she also enrolled in a GFA Bible college to train to become a woman missionary. Women missionaries are very important. They minister to women. They go door to door praying with women in ways that male missionaries cannot do for obvious reasons. And so she continued her husband's work outside the prison while he continued it inside. And their children grew up with that sort of separation. For 9 years, Manja was in the Nepali prisons. Then the government changed. The charges, of course, everyone knew were not real, and he was released. This was the day of his release when he was reunited with his family. And he was interviewed about a month after he was released. And I want to read you just a short section of that interview. Manja's words about his experience. Before I was arrested, I was a missionary and went around villages and shared the gospel with people. And that conviction and that commitment I still have in my heart, even though I was in prison for so many years. I was doing ministry before I was arrested. I did ministry while I was in the prison, and I decided that when I come out, I'm going to do the same thing I was doing before. That is my resolution. That is what I am going to do. I will preach the gospel and plant churches. That is in my heart. In his heart, in his wife's heart, they continue ministering in Nepal to this day. He actually is one of our field leaders there. And his children have grown. His son is in Bible college training to be a missionary. This family story caused me to ask a question. What causes that kind of commitment to reaching the lost? A commitment that will carry you through torture and separation and prison, through loneliness, and out again and continuing forward. What is it that gives them a passion that can survive that kind of opposition and that will press forward anyway? It makes me wonder about myself. How do I get some of that? My family and I are missionaries behind the scenes. I'll tell you a little more about that later. And I will tell you that there's nothing magical that happens to you when you become a missionary. You're still just a regular old person with your own desires and your wants. And there's nothing, it's a privilege. It's not something you get because you somehow deserved it or were special. And so it was for them. So what was the difference? And I've become convinced that you cannot listen to an inspiring or not so inspiring speaker. You cannot read a book. You cannot take a medicine that will give you a passion like that will endure, that will sacrifice at whatever level the Lord calls you to sacrifice. I believe that if we are going to have not Manja's passion for the lost, but if we're to have Christ's passion for the lost, he's going to have to give it to us. And the way he does that, as I see it in Scripture, is that he opens our eyes to see people the way he sees them, so that we can have his passion. Let me show you what I mean. Matthew records a bit of Jesus' ministry in Matthew 9:35. And Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every affliction. When he saw the multitudes, he was deeply moved with compassion for them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. When he saw, he was deeply moved. What did he see? He saw the multitudes. There's a crowd in this picture. This picture was taken in a part of the world where the odds are no one in that crowd has ever heard of Jesus. He saw multitudes lost. Those words, harassed and helpless, were the words they used when wolves got in among their sheep. Like sheep without a shepherd. He was moved to compassion because he saw them, and he saw what was really going on in the inside. Isaiah describes the people of Jesus' time as those dwelling in darkness and walking in deep darkness. And that is where many of the peoples of the world are today. In fact, Christ today still sees the multitudes. What does he see now? We know what he saw in the first century, but what does he see now when he looks at the multitudes of the world? To answer that question, I'm going to play just a brief segment of a video, not that GFA created, another missions organization created, that does a great job of summarizing what is the state of the world today.
So, how are we doing accomplishing our mission? To answer that, let's classify the 7 billion people on the earth today into 3 groups. Let's start with the Christians. About 33% of the world's population would identify itself as Christian. We call this segment of the population World C, C for Christian. It's important to remember that not all of the people that fall into World C are true believers in Christ. They merely identify themselves as Christian because of nominal belief in Jesus, or because they live in a country where everyone is considered Christian, so they would do the same. Next, there's the 38% of the world that has access to the gospel but has chosen not to follow Jesus. They have Bibles in their language, churches nearby, friends or co-workers who are potentially Christians, or access to other Christian resources in their language. These people have access to the good news, but just haven't acted on it yet. This segment of the population is called World B. That leaves us with 29% of the world, just over 1 out of every 4 people on this planet who not only have never heard of Jesus, they have no chance of hearing the good news of Jesus Christ. They have no access to the gospel, no Bibles, no churches, no believers nearby, no chance to learn about Jesus. We call that 29% World A.
World A. What do we mean when we use the word unreached? It's World A. It means they have no chance of hearing. They are people who dwell in total spiritual darkness. They've not rejected the gospel, they've just never heard it. They've not ignored Jesus. They don't even know who he is. Neither does anyone living near them. They can't turn on the radio and listen to the gospel. They can't pick up a Bible and read about it. None of those things are present. I don't know about you, but that's hard for me to imagine. I was born into the church, more or less. My dad was a pastor. I was raised in the church from before my memory. Our house has been filled with Bibles and is still, as is probably yours. We're surrounded by the light of the gospel. So what is it like to be in total darkness? You can read statistics all day long, and for me, it doesn't do it. It doesn't let me understand it. To understand it, I need to see. So let me help you see. this family. This picture was taken about 2 years ago. My daughter reads stories that come in from the mission field as they come into our office before we write them up and send them out. And when she read this story, it really struck her, and so she brought it home and read it to me at the supper table one night. And this picture came with it. The man's name is Mossy, and this is his family. Mossy's a day laborer like everyone in his village. That means he works on Tuesday for what he eats on Wednesday, in the fields or whatever sorts of jobs he can find. They're very poor. To make ends meet, they have a few farm animals, and that helps with both food and with income. Pretty typical. They lived in World A, in the unreached world. There were no believers in their village, nor had there ever been for thousands of years. There were no churches, no Bibles. He had never heard the name Jesus in his life. Neither had anyone in his family. But they weren't just in that kind of a spiritual darkness. They were in an even deeper darkness. It's also difficult for me to understand. His daughter, Jana, the one in the gray t-shirt there, she was 12 at the time. She was possessed by an evil spirit. That sounds really strange to me, as no doubt it does to you. But in places where the gospel has never been, where Satan has reigned unchallenged for 2,000-3,000 years, he shows his hand in ways he does not here. This evil spirit tormented not only Jana, but the entire family. First, it was just the psychological and spiritual torment. Then their animals began to die one by one for no reason until they had none left. Then the family began to fall ill, every single one of them. When Mossy was ill, he could not work. When he did not work, they did not eat. They were sick and they were starving. He became desperate. He had been praying to his gods. He had many, doing all the right things, and nothing was working. So he decided to abandon his religion and start looking for another one. And so he went around asking people for a solution. And of course, there were other religions available. Each of them required a payment of some sort for the priest to pray for him, or for some sacrifice to be made, or some ritual to be performed. And so he sold what belongings they had in order to pay the fees, trying to free his family, and especially his daughter Jana. Jana knew that she was the center of the issue, and she would tell her father, "I'm sorry that I am causing so much suffering in our family." Nothing worked, of course. And then his wife fell seriously ill, and he was concerned for her life. He was at the end of his rope, and someone told him, "There is a wizard that you can travel to see. Maybe he can help you." I don't know what a wizard is in their culture, but he went. He was desperate. And he explained to this wizard everything that had been happening about his daughter, about the sickness, about the oppression. This is what the wizard told him, and I quote, "If you want to get a permanent solution for this problem, you must sacrifice your daughter. Then only will this spirit leave you and your family. There is no other way to get freedom from this spirit." No other way. What would you do? His daughter Jana is the same age as my youngest daughter. If your choice was between watching your family starve and be tormented, or between sacrificing your daughter, or watching all of you suffer, he tried every other way. When this guy told him there was no other way, he knew of nothing else. The gospel, Christ, was not an option. He'd never heard of that way. And so he made a decision that, I don't know what I would have done. He decided that the only way out was to end his life and the life of everyone in his family at the same time. So he went to a store and bought a bottle of rat poison and headed home to poison their meal. That's what total spiritual darkness is like, having no way out. Now, you may be thinking, surely this is not everyone's plight, and you're right. This sort of oppression is not everyone's lot, although it is not uncommon in the places where our missionaries work. And yet, is it really much different for anyone that never hears the name of Christ? I mean, think about this. If one demon could make this family so miserable that the father was willing to end the lives of his entire family, then what must hell be like? They lived in this green earth. They had family. They knew the love of relationships, and still they were that miserable. What must it be like when everything good is gone and the only thing left is darkness and evil? That is the plight of every single person in the unreached areas in World A, where it is completely dark. How do we respond to that? What can we do about it? Well, partly I think we just need to understand the scope of it. How many people are we really talking about that are in this position? Well, I'll tell you the number. It's 2.1 billion, give or take a couple hundred million. 2.1 billion is a number that means absolutely nothing to me. I don't know about you. I can picture maybe 50,000 in a football stadium or 100,000 on the National Mall, but a billion or 2 billion? So I tried to put it in perspective, and I thought, well, I know about our country. So picture our country, all the men, women, and children in all 50 states. And now imagine total spiritual darkness. No more Bibles, no churches, no believers, no gospel radio, nothing. No hint of the gospel. That many people in complete spiritual darkness. Now imagine that there were 2 countries like that many people. 3 times our entire population. Now imagine 4 times, 5 times the number of men, women, and children. 6, 7, 7. 7 times the population of our country is what 2 billion people is. That many people are in this kind of darkness. And death is not waiting for us to reach them. It's easy for me to think, well, it's been so many years, what's the big hurry? For people like Mossy and his family, they only had minutes for someone to reach them with the light. For 90,000 people in World A, yesterday was their last day. For 90,000 more, today will be their last day. It's not because of some natural disaster or COVID or anything like that. That's just what death does when 2 billion people are in darkness. 90,000 people a day will never hear the gospel because they are dying. I saw this picture in the news a few years back at the height of COVID. It's a picture of a mass cremation ground in India. And it's a terrible picture. But that was nothing compared to what just happens every single day. That's just the nature of death. The question is really not how we should respond, but how did Christ respond? How does Christ respond? Well, we don't have to guess. Matthew tells us how he responded when he saw the state of the multitudes. When he saw the multitudes, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." How did he respond? He said, "Pray earnestly, send out laborers into the harvest." If you think about Jesus' ministry on earth, what did he do? He poured most of his time into 12 or 40 or 72 men that he was training to send out with the gospel. His response to multitudes in darkness was to train and send missionaries. His last words to his disciples were, "Go, make disciples." His response is to send the gospel, and he chose to use us to do it. So how have we been doing? It's been 2,000 years since he began what you might call the missionary movement. Well, we'll go back to our little video and watch a couple more minutes to give us an idea of where things currently stand with reaching the unreached.
Now, on to missionaries. Only 1 out of every 1,800 Christians in World C decides to serve as a cross-cultural missionary. So, we can pull 400,000 missionaries out of that World C population. That's our total cross-cultural missionary force worldwide. Did you know that 72% of all our missionaries are going to World C? That's right. The vast majority of the missionaries being sent out are going to the people of the world that have Bibles and established churches. 25% of the missionaries are sent to World B, where there is already some access to the church and to the Bible. That leaves only 3% of the total missionary force to handle all of World A, the section of the population without any chance of hearing about Jesus. 29% of the world has no way to hear the gospel, but we're sending only a tiny portion of our Christian workers to them. What about finances? Annually, all those Christians in World C earn a total of $42 trillion. And together, they give about $700 billion to Christian causes each year. That includes everything: Christian nonprofits, churches, youth programs, missions, etc. Can you do the math? Less than 2% of Christian income is being given to Christ's causes. Out of that $700 billion given to all Christian causes, only $45 billion is given to missions specifically. That's a little over 6%. In fact, there is more money reported embezzled from the church each year than is given to missions. Remember those 400,000 missionaries? We have $45 billion to support them and their cross-cultural work. But how exactly is it allocated? Well, $39 billion goes to World C every year. Yep, 87% of that missions money is being spent in areas of the world that have Bibles and churches available. $5.4 billion, or 12%, goes to World B each year, those that have access to the gospel message but have rejected it. That leaves only $450 million, or 1% of all missions money going to World A, the least reached people of the world. To put that into perspective, annually Americans spend more money on Halloween costumes for their pets than gets sent to World A. To summarize, only 3% of our missionary force, armed with only 1% of missions giving, is going out to reach the 2 billion people who don't have access to the gospel.
So not only are nearly a third of the world's population still unreached, very little in terms of people and resources are going to reach them. Worse than that, if I had given you this presentation 10 years ago, in fact 20 years ago, the numbers would have been essentially the same. We have stopped making progress at reaching the unreached. Well, to put it differently, people are being born faster than we're reaching them. There are more people actually today who have never heard the gospel than there were 10 years ago. So what happened? Is it just that people are heartless and they're sending people all the wrong places? No. It's because of the faithfulness and sacrifice and sending of believers that it's only a third that's in darkness. Jesus started with a tiny group of people, and since then, 2/3 and a little better of the world have heard the gospel. There is at least access to it where they live. 5.7 billion people do have access to the gospel. But what about those that remain? How come we're not reaching them? How come so little is being sent to them? Well, it's because it's so difficult to get to them. We'll start with geography. Most of the remaining, 96% of the remaining unreached peoples live in this sort of arbitrary box that you can draw on a map called the 1040 window. It has no meaning except that it's an easy way of seeing where everyone's at. This box, though, has a different name. In missions, it's called the resistant belt. It's unreached because it is really hard to reach. It's hard in a lot of different ways. The first one is just to get there. 60% of these countries severely restrict or absolutely forbid anyone from entering the country to plant churches or proclaim the gospel. If you get in, it's hard to stay in. It's a constant battle. But there are even more barriers to what I grew up with as international missions, sending people to other countries. This family on the left is some friends of mine that are international missionaries. They were trained and sent to another country where the gospel had not yet been, but it was difficult. The first obstacle they had to get across was getting a visa. And as soon as they got there, they had to figure out how they were going to get it renewed. While they were battling that, they were trying to learn the language, which is extraordinarily difficult and took them a couple of years. Once they got past the language barriers, there were physical barriers. The water was not safe to drink for them. They could not eat the food safely. They had to figure out a way to live. They couldn't live the way the people they were reaching were living. It was physically difficult. Health is a problem. Most of us are just not cut out to live in some of the hardest, most remote places of the world. And then on top of that, just because of their skin color and the country they're from, everything they said is automatically suspect. In the places of the world in Southeast Asia and Northern Africa, it is not a plus to be from the West. It is not considered something that gives weight to your message. Rather, you're seen as someone just trying to recolonize those parts of the world. And finally, just the cost is a barrier. The average cost to put a missionary family in one of these countries is about $120,000 a year. Doesn't sound too bad until you realize how many missionaries are needed. In India alone, there are 500,000 villages where no one has ever taken the gospel. And I don't mean villages of a hut of 30 people, villages of 7,000 people. Let's suppose that a missionary was incredibly productive and could reach 5 villages. Then we'd need to send 100,000 just to reach those villages. 100,000 missionaries would be $12 billion a year. That's not only 4 times as much as is currently being used in the unreached world, it's more than all of World A and World B put together. And that's just one country where the unreached dwell. As a result of all of those barriers, only 3%, as the video said, make it to the unreached. Not that they're not doing wonderful work. The world is full right outside these walls of people who do not know the Lord. But they're not reaching the people who've never heard. They remain in darkness. So what do we conclude? We've done what we can. We reach the people we can reach, and do we just abandon them? I don't believe we can abandon them, because Christ hasn't abandoned them, and we are his people, his body. In Revelation we read, speaking of Christ, with your blood you purchased men for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. Every one of them. All these little dots on the map that look kind of like people, each one of those is a people group, a language, a tribe, numbering in the millions or tens of millions that is completely unreached. If Christ died for people, if he is calling people into his kingdom from every tribe and language and tongue and nation, if he paid the price for them, we can't just abandon them because they're hard to get to. Imagine if you came home one night and you found your house on fire and your family was inside and you ran to get them out, but you found the front door locked and you didn't have a key. Well, you wouldn't just shrug your shoulders and walk off and say, well, that's too bad. No, you'd get a rock, you'd break a window, you'd find a way in. These are the family of God. He bought them. He has not given up, and he has provided a way. That way, in this time, are national missionaries. What's a national missionary? You're probably familiar with that, since many of you know Paula, but I'll tell you briefly. An international missionary is someone who goes from one country to take the gospel to another country. A national missionary is someone who's born in a country and takes it to the people of that country. Now, in the beginning, when there is no one in a country who's a believer, international missionaries are the only kind. Those are the kind, really, that Jesus sent out to all the world. But in most of these countries, there is a population that knows the Lord, a very small population, and they want to reach their own people. Those are the national missionaries. This man standing with me in the picture is one I met in northern India. His name, well, I'll call him Sanjeep. He'd been a missionary for about 6 years when I met him. And I was in a village with him where there had never been a church, but now there was a church. He was a national missionary. Nothing special about him except he was called by the Lord to go, and so we sent him. He has an advantage, a lot of advantages, over international missionaries when you're trying to reach the unreached. He doesn't have legal barriers. He's already a citizen. He doesn't have a language barrier. He grew up there and speaks the language as a native. He doesn't have physical barriers. He can drink the water and eat the food and not have a single problem with it. He doesn't face the anti-Western sentiment. He looks the same and comes from the same people as the people he's seeking to reach. As a result of all of the missionaries we train in our Bible colleges across Southeast Asia, 95% of them make it to unreached areas. And when they get there, they have such an incredible effectiveness because of the way the Lord's working through people reaching their own people. That one man, Sanjeep, he graduated from one of our Bible colleges. He'd been out for 6 years, and that time he'd planted 2 churches in 2 different villages. The one in which I worshiped with him had about 135 believers in a village where 3 years before there had never been a believer at all. I sat and worshiped and looked out over the congregation and realized 3 years ago, none of these people knew the Lord, and watched them praising the Lord. In that time, that little church that had been alive for only 3 years had sent 5 of their young men to Bible college to become missionaries. So in 6 years, this one young man, there was nothing special about him, had planted 2 churches and quintupled himself as a missionary. And that's happening all over the mission field. We had over 2,000 young men and women join our Bible colleges this year to train to become missionaries. In fact, we have vastly more missionaries than we have people to send them. It seems people are more willing to go and suffer the consequences that Manja faced in Nepal than there are who are willing to send them. But what about the finances? Well, it still costs money. It costs a lot less. That's the good news. These men and women can live and minister for 25 times less than an international missionary. For the cost of one family like mine to go to an unreached country, we can support 25 national missionary families ministering in their own countries. Yet, the churches in their countries are very small and very poor. And while it seems like a great deal for us that a missionary family can do this sort of work for $3,000 or $4,000 a year, to them, that's an astronomical amount. They have all the access to the unreached and the desire to go, but none of the resources. On the other hand, here in the U.S., we have all the resources, more resources than any Christian nation has ever had in the history of the world. And yet we have almost no access to the unreached. We can't get there, but we've got lots of resources. They're already there, and they have none. Gospel for Asia was founded on the idea that maybe we can get these people together. Maybe those who want to go and can could be linked with those who want to go and can't, but do have the funds to send them. And that's what we do. That's what my family lives to accomplish. To connect we who are most able to send, partnering them with those who are most able to go, the national missionaries, to reach those who most need to hear the gospel and have never heard it before, while there is still time. Time is precious. For Masi and his family, help did come in time, just. He was on his way home that night with that bottle of poison in his pocket, and he just collapsed under a light pole. He just couldn't go any further. And he was weeping there by himself. When one of our missionaries, this man on the right, his name is Jepa, he had a church in a neighboring village, but there was nothing in this village as of yet. He was just there for the day doing outreach, and he happened to come upon Masi that night at that particular moment. He saw him sobbing there, and so he went over and he put his hand on him and he said, "Hey, I'm a pastor. Can I pray for you? Is there anything I can do?" And Masi jumped up and grabbed hold of him and said, "Please save me and my family." Of course, Jepa had no idea what was going on, and so he got him to tell him his story, and he told him everything. He told him about his daughter and the sickness and the starvation. He told him about the wizard. He even told him what he was about to do. I want to read to you exactly what Pastor Jepa shared with him, in addition to many other things. He said, "We do not need to sacrifice anything because Jesus has done it once for all. Jesus loves you and your family. If you are ready to truly believe in him and trust in him fully, without any doubt, he will deliver you and your family." In many other words, he convinced Masi to wait a couple of days and bring his family to the neighboring village where there was a church, so that the pastor in the church could pray for his family to be delivered. And he did, August 29th, 2021, almost exactly 2 years ago. Mossy and his family showed up at the church. Pastor Jeppa and the believers in that little church gathered around him, and they began to pray that God would deliver this family. And as they began to pray, his daughter Jana, the beautiful little 12-year-old girl, went berserk, tried to attack the pastor, was screaming and spitting and yelling terrible things. Things like, "This family belongs to me, and you cannot take this family from me." And they kept praying anyway. They had to restrain her. For 45 minutes, nothing happened except the believers prayed, and Jana was screaming. And then suddenly, she yelled one more time, "Leave me and let me go, and I will not disturb Jana and her family anymore." The pastor rebuked the evil spirit in Jesus' name, and he left. And Jana was back in her right mind, and everything was quiet. And the father knew the oppression was gone. And he gave all glory to God, whom he barely knew anything about. He and his family began to attend the church and learn more about this Jesus that had delivered them. Very soon, they were baptized and became a part of that church. And then a church began to meet in their home, in their village, where there had never been believers before. Through their family's suffering and then deliverance, a new church was founded. But really, it was God at work through his people. Not just through Jeppa, this missionary that God sent, but through his church. Not just through them, but through the people who sent Jeppa and his wife to Bible college and then to this village and supported them so that they could even be there, for him to be there at that light pole on that night to meet that man and rescue this family. God even worked through people like me and my family who are sitting at a desk somewhere in East Texas, connecting people here with people like Jeppa so that he could go. God works powerfully through his people when they respond to his call, whatever that call looks like in their lives. The need for the gospel is still huge. There are so many people who have not heard, and yet God has provided a way to reach them. There's so much opportunity right now. Like I said, more missionaries are willing to go than we have resources to send them. And so, what? We're sitting here. What can we do about it? What does it even look like to somehow be involved in this? I could give you a bunch of bullet points, but instead I just want to tell you how God led my family and I, and how he led us to respond, because I grew up in the church, as I mentioned, and had no idea of any of this well into my 30s. I went to a Christian conference for men one weekend, and in between sessions, I was headed for the restrooms, and this guy at a table full of books yelled and said, "Hey, I have a free book for you if you'll promise to read it." And I'm kind of a book nerd, and so I thought, well, I like free books. And I asked him, what is it? Because I didn't want to be tricked into reading something I didn't want to read. And he said, it's called Revolution in World Missions. And I thought, that sounds really dull. And I looked pretty skeptical, evidently. And so he said, this book changed my life more than any other book but the Bible. And I thought, wow, that's some kind of recommendation. So I very unwisely took the book. And I read it on the way home. Now, you have to understand where we were at that point in our lives. I was a young computer database architect. I had about an 8-year career going. Getting paid well. We had plans to retire really early and travel the world, probably do some mission work. That's what I told myself. I had 2, almost 3 little kids. I had a little house, 3 bedrooms. Everything was comfortable. Our plans were laid out. My life was arranged just like a lot of bowling pins in a nice, neat little triangle. And then I took that book and read it, and everything fell apart. What I read was essentially what I shared with you this morning. I had no idea so many people had not heard. I figured since you can get anywhere in the world on a plane in about 24 hours, how could there still be people who don't know the gospel? But there are so many. I knew that we couldn't keep doing what we were doing, but I wasn't sure what to do. So I started by just giving the book to my wife and said, here, read this. And she did. And we both knew we had to change something. And we didn't really know where to start, so we prayed about it. And we just did the simplest thing. God said, sponsor some of these national missionaries. GFA made it easy. I went online, I signed up for 5 missionaries. I had no idea who they were. These 5 young men, most of them were still in Bible college. And we started to pray for them. It was that simple. At least it started that way. But things progressed, as you probably guessed, since I'm standing up here. And I wanted to let my wife tell you that story because we did have a young family, and we had to work this out as a family, what it meant to respond to the call of God. And I wanted her to tell you more about that.
So, as we were thinking about all of this, because it did require a lot of changes and praying, we kind of were looking around, and one thing that we'd already been convicted about a little bit was as we looked at families around us, we would see godly parents strong, but their children not following the Lord. And one of the main purposes that God lays out in his word for family is to raise godly offspring who will continue to teach of him and have the generations continue. We didn't want that to be the way that our family went, to not actually do that. So as we were asking him, we realized that this was probably part of it. So one of the first things that he directed us to do to kind of pass this passion that God had just given us onto our children was to take the Christmas catalog that GFA puts out and to allow the girls to go through it and shop for things to give to help missionaries and those that they were reaching. Our kids were really young. We wanted them to be aware of the needs. So when they first started, we had to explain the purposes of the gifts. You know, what good would some chickens do for these people? What good would tracts do, or a New Testament, or a goat, or a water buffalo?
I'm sorry we don't have time for more, but that was really touching to hear the girls share their angle from that. But I would love to tell you a dozen stories, but I can't. But would you give me time to tell you one story that's kind of personal, not about someone else, but about the guy in front of you? Would you give me 10 or 15 minutes to do that? Okay. Last year, coming home from Texas, I'm sorry. Last year, coming home from Texas, we stopped. Well, no, before we came home from Texas, we went to see KP's. They live a quarter of a mile from our house. When we came home, I told him, I'm embarrassed. KP and Gisela have had millions of dollars go through their hands. They could be living in a multi-million-dollar house. They could be driving the most expensive cars there are. You saw what he's driving. When we came home, I told him, the possessions in the house that we have temporarily are worth more than the possessions in their house. They choose to live simply every day to reach the unreached. And their children are just as into it as they are. So, Coming home, we stopped in along the way at a place that I wanted to stop to look at it was sort of a business thing, and I'm not going to tell you what it was, but when Neil and I pulled into this farm, we were met by a man, and he told us about his business. Now, 2 hours later, we left there, and I really wanted to talk to this man about different things, and I could barely get a word in edgewise. Now, if you know Paul Yoder, and you know that Paul Yoder can't get a word in edgewise, that means someone else did a lot of talking. We left there, and the 2 hours consisted of on and on and on, how we made $1 million here. We made $100,000 on a pair of ostriches. We made on and on and on. We are in the process of buying another between $3 and $4 million farm. It was all about money and being a success financially. We had just come from Texas, stopped here. As we were ready to leave, this was a Mennonite man, a conservative Mennonite man. As we were ready to leave, I had never met the guy, knew very little of him, just found out from someone else where he lives. As we left, or ready to leave, he said, he's a bishop of 48 families. I was sick. Honestly, I had an upset feeling in my stomach. Here, an Anabaptist bishop has everything the world could offer, and he's using it. He's using everything the world can offer. Now, I'm not going to tell you his name. You won't hear it from me, because I don't want you to think evil of this man. I don't know. Maybe this man sends $1 million a year to charities. I don't know. But what I do know is he never mentioned God. He never mentioned the Bible. It was all about possessions and how they make more and more possessions. That really stunned me. And as I came home, I thought, I'm an old man, 67 years old. I don't have much time left. And probably before long, I'll either sit on a rocking chair twiddling my thumbs because I can't work anymore, or some disease is racking my body, or I'll fall over dead. Bottom line is, I don't have much time left. As I sit there, and most of you people, I don't care if you're 4 years old, you don't have much time left. But as you sit there and you think about your life, if you take a moment and look back over your life, what do you see? And I'll tell you what I saw. I love nice things. And I'll tell you unashamedly, we had 2 of the nicest farms in our community. We had nice equipment. We have one of the best herds of cattle you'll ever find. But I'm afraid that when I look at the parable of the sower, and where Jesus said a sower went out to sow, and he threw the seeds. Some fell on stony ground, some fell on hard ground, some fell on rocky soil or thorny soil, and some fell on good ground. I'm afraid that the soil that fell among thorns is a picture of my life. And that is, yes, I like Logry, Mr. Logry. I grew up in the church. I don't know, I was only a couple weeks old when I first went to church. So I've heard about the Bible and had godly examples of Christian parents and Christian community and so on. But Jesus said, as he talked about the thorny ground, it sprang up and it grew. But the cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches, and the lust of other things crowded it out so that it became unfruitful. Now, the cares of this world are not sin. The way I understand it, the cares of this world are having a beautiful farm, a nice house, a freshly mowed yard, the beautiful flowers. Anything that you do that doesn't glorify God, but glorifies yourself. I'm not suggesting you shouldn't have a farm. I'm not suggesting you shouldn't have a garden. But I am suggesting if you do it to build the kingdom, more power to you. But if you're building it, if you're doing it for yourself, for what you can get out of it here in this life, one day, in a poof, it's going to be gone. Consider that carefully. Now, before I leave, there are books on the back table. Please take those books along. It's the book that he showed up here, which is Revolution World Missions. There's some of them there with this cover and some of them with another cover. There's No Longer a Slum Dog on the back. Get one of them. There's another one, Transforming Communities with God's Love. Get them. And then there's a gift catalog. Get one of them. And don't be embarrassed by taking one of each. And if you have someone that you think might read them, take one for them. Build the kingdom. That's all I have to say. So it's back to you guys.